Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm Usman Butt, a video producer. My guest today is Justin Stearns. Justin received a BA in English and History from Dartmouth College in 1998 and his PhD in the Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University in 2007. He is Professor of Arab Crossroads Studies at York University Abu Dhabi. His research interests focus on the intersection of law, science, and theology in pre-modern Muslim Middle East. His first book was a comprehensive intellectual history of Muslim and Christian understanding of contagion, especially in the context of the plague, entitled Infectious Ideas, Contagion in Pre-Modern Islamic and Christian Thought in the Western Mediterranean, from Johns Hopkins University Press in 2011. His book on the social status of natural sciences in the early modern Morocco, entitled Revealed Sciences, the Natural Sciences in Islam in the early modern Morocco, which is with Cambridge University Press, was published in 2001. And his first volume of his edited and translation of Al-Yusi, who lived between 1102 or 1691, Discourses, appeared with the Library of Arabic Literature in 2020. He is currently working on a second volume of the Discourses, and together with a group of students is engaging in long-term projects to establish a searchable database for all of all catalogued Moroccan manuscripts. I almost got through that okay. Justin, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
It's so good to be here, Usman. Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure to have you, and it's been really interesting to sort of engage with some of your work over the years. I've read a few of your books, particularly the one on Morocco, which we will discuss, and obviously you've got a new one that's out, and you've had other books out previously as well as articles. But I sort of want to open this by asking, what actually drew you to want to study Morocco in the first place, and specifically, and the Arab world, but specifically also the history of science. What do you think, what drew you to this, and what do you think these sorts of topics offer us?
Well, there's a lot there. So, I mean, on the one hand, there's kind of like the origin story, and that's clearly that I found myself in my senior year in college, not really knowing what I was going to do with my life, but realizing even at that stage that I probably wasn't good for much except the academy. So I applied for grants, and I was lucky enough to get one and went to go to Morocco to study Arabic. And once there, I obviously fell in love with Morocco on the one hand. Then I ended up in graduate school later on. And when I was in graduate school, I was fascinated with Al-Andalus. So you can see the Islamic West in general, this kind of connection between sort of the European Christian world and the North African Muslim world, and sort of Iberia. Al-Andalus was this kind of meeting place of the two. And at that point in time, I was really taken with the notion, and this is getting to your question of why science, of how both cultural, religious spheres were struck by this massive natural disaster, the Black Death in the 14th century. And that provided me with a way into the intellectual worlds. How did they respond? How did two societies placed under immense strain by such just a tremendous, overwhelming epidemic? How do they respond to this? How do they think about this? And so then you have to think about, well, what were their intellectual traditions? What did they have to cope with, to rely upon? And medicine was chiefly one of those, right? And so in writing the first book, Infectious Ideas, about medicine, about how the notion of contagion, and also how that was not just a medical idea, but also a one which was inflected with theological implications, like why were people dying? Why, if there's one God and we believe in this one God, something that the Christians and Muslims shared, then why were so many people dying? And I think we can all emphasize with that sort of question of theodicy, of why is there suffering? And so I struggled with that for a couple of years. And in the process of writing that first book, I realized that, and this comes to your question of like, what can these stories tell us? That it's not just about sort of the empirical questions of how people in the 14th century responded to plague. It's also a question about, well, who do we understand ourselves to be today, and what is our relationship to the past and to the different stories we tell ourselves about living in the 21st century in this modern period, right? And so when you look back, then you find yourself always measuring the past by the present. This is something that historians are always telling themselves not to do, and yet inevitably we find ourselves doing it, at least with the categories that we use and the way that we frame stories. And so that process, when it comes into it then, so what does it tell us? What kinds of things can we learn? We can learn a lot about who we think we are, who we have portrayed others to be, right? Because the question here is in part, who is the us we're talking about? Are we talking about people sitting in North America or in England? Are we talking about Moroccans? Are we talking about people sitting in Abu Dhabi today, where I am? So then you learn also a lot about what the world is like today and how we divide ourselves up into different traditions, different intellectual heritages, and how we compartmentalize and frame some people as different than ourselves.
It's kind of interesting when you think about it, because in a way, the history of science sort of sits at in an uneasy place within the field of history generally, because if you think about it, there's two sort of landmines from a historical perspective with the history of science. There's the idea that, we shouldn't be overly, calling someone a presentist is a kind of charge. So the idea that you're taking our concerns today, our ideas, our concepts, and back projecting it is something a lot of historians tend to be very, they don't really like that idea very much, or at least they think you should be suspicious of those, because categories change over time, meaning changes over time. How a society thinks about something in the 12th century is not necessarily how they react to it today. And yet, on the other hand, there is a sense that it does matter today. There is a connection, but you also want to avoid this area of, well, we now know, right? Because when it comes to ideas to do with science and medicine, you say, we now know that we don't use wet cupping to cure and humor theory and so on. So I'm wondering, so I think of this as a kind of interesting contention in the field. How do you navigate those?
Well, I think what it comes down to is one has to be clear with oneself and one's reader about what question one's really interested in. So in this field, you're absolutely right. There are people who are principally interested in being able to draw a line from, say, Aristotelian philosophy through kind of, the reception of Aristotelian philosophy amongst Muslims and Christians through to the early modern period until today. And so you have this very linear trajectory, and in the process you have it's progress. And the history of science itself as a field is born of this idea of that we're moving towards the arrival of science, capital S, in the 19th century and then into the 20th. And that's a specific thing, and everything that happened before can be measured by that result, right? And that, of course, there are reasons to be interested in that question. Many historians also, I count myself among them, recognize that a certain kind of epistemological violence is being done to the past in the process, because what you're doing is you're cutting out everything that mattered in the past that doesn't matter in the present. And as such, you are denying yourself a full understanding of how people who wrote in the natural sciences in the past actually practiced and studied and transmitted that knowledge in order to get to a better linear narrative of what you think is going on today and what's valuable today. Now, there are reasons why scientists specifically who are working within their own traditions are very interested in that linear trajectory of progress. But in myself, when I try to write these histories, I try to best understand how people in the past made sense of the natural world. And in that process, I'm much more likely to say, no, you've got to stop here. And you actually have to try to understand the full framing. And it's something that people have gotten better at doing in European his sort of intellectual history than in the Muslim world, because so we can say that, okay, yes, so Newton had these esoteric interests and he was a very devout Christian with his own very specific religious interests. And we can accept that, I think, even though now it's still taking us some time, but in the broader public, but within the historical field, we can accept that much more readily than we can say of some of the Islamic figures that I discuss.
It reminds me of that when you mentioned Newton. It reminds me of the John Maynard Keynes quote. Newton was not the first of the mathematicians, he was the last of the magicians. But you see this sort of trend in the past to try and categorize things. Well, this is not science, this is magic. And obviously there is a certain view which comes out of sort of 20th century European philosophy that the science, if we're going to go back and say the past, what we want to understand is the progress to our time. So we're interested in certain historical ideas that seem to be pushing in our direction. There's this idea also that if we listen to certain people at certain times, we could have had the Enlightenment earlier, right? You see this with, if we'd listened to Galileo, if he hadn't been persecuted by the church. And it's really interesting because, it's a very ahistorical way of thinking about ideas and time. It's also sort of, I don't think people acknowledge this enough when it comes to European history. A lot of it is rooted in sectarianism as well. So Galileo's story is not just about Galileo, it's about the Catholic Church.
Oh, absolutely. These are very Protestant stories. These are kind of Protestant narratives that emerged in the late 19th century, very explicitly so, that there being a good kind of religion, i.e. Protestant Christianity, and there being a bad kind of religion, i.e. Catholicism, and everything else, including Islam and whatnot. And this is the kind of, so if Weber argues, right, at the beginning of the 20th century, that it's the Protestant work ethic that brings us capitalism, which brings us kind of the modern world, then some of his students later on will argue that modern science comes as well out of kind of Northern Europe in sort of Protestantism. And these narratives then shape, it's not like they were made up out of whole cloth. It's just they're made up of a selective awareness of facts, in part because not all of the facts were available to the people making them, and of a strong Northern European bias against Catholicism and kind of the notion of the Black legend regarding Spain and stuff like that. So yes, no, these are, and that's, I guess, part of what makes the work of intellectual history so fascinating, is that you're not just telling one story, you're always having to move on two registers at the same time. How you depict the past inevitably has an effect on how people understand their contemporary situation, right? This is part of the reason it's dangerous to go, on the one hand, we want to be like, okay, we live in a world where we have a great deal of Islamophobia and where Muslims are routinely kind of depicted as other and not part of, quote unquote, the modern or the rational or whatever you want to call it. And so you want to be able to step in and say, wait, no, let's go back. Let's uncover the complexity of Islamic heritage and the engagement with various forms of natural sciences and the inquiry and looking into the way the natural world works. But you also don't want to go overboard and say, okay, everything that is modern and rational and scientific comes from the Muslim world, right? And so which has happened more out of, I think, a desire at times to push back against the Islamophobia that exists in the public sphere, and which is so has such dire social effects today. So you have to find a place and be clear to your reader or your audience and to yourself about the complexities of these two stories that you're telling, and try not to sort of hunker down into too much of a kind of essentialism at any point in time.
Which just brings us quite nicely to your book that was published, I think, in 2021, Revealed Sciences in Morocco, because in the introduction, you actually open up by referring to, his name's gone out of my head now. Was it Popper you referred to?
Kuhn.
Popper.
Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn.
Sorry, Thomas Kuhn. I always get those two.
Yeah.
I always get those two mixed up. They're around the same time, but they're effectively diametric opposites of each other in a way, because the Popper idea of history is very similar to the narrative we've just mentioned, where you have this sort of linear progress towards science, and it's always self-correcting. But you sort of caution people to think more in the Kuhnian sense, to think about paradigms.
Right.
And once we reach the end of a paradigm, it's not so much the case that there's a direct linear progress. It's the paradigm works up until a certain point. I wonder if you could sort of bring us.
Yeah. So Kuhn uses at the end, what I tried to do with Kuhn, I think that Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is an example of one of those books which is, you can read it and it kind of messes with your mind. It forces you to rethink some of the things you've brought with you to the table, and you kind of sit there and you go like, huh. And instead of taking that, I also think that therefore, in many ways, it's a book is wrong. It's a good book which is wrong. And there's an interesting subgenre of books which that is true. But I stick with Kuhn for a little bit because he opens up and gives us a way of thinking about the possibility of multiple lineages of rationality or of engagement with the natural sciences, right? So he uses at the end of his book he evokes the Darwinian tree of life as a way of saying, look, these individual ways of interacting are all moving outwards in differential ways. There is no absolute truth towards which they are moving. This is Kuhn's larger intervention, is to say we are not progressing sort of an asymptotic graph towards truth that you might get out of a classic history, early 20th century history of science narrative. We are all progressing in these ways which bear on the truth claims that are being made within these individual paradigms. And in that sense, I say, well, maybe that's useful to help us think about how in the Muslim world between sort of, let me back up for a second. In the classical narrative of the relay race towards progress, after Europeans in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, and early Renaissance start finish translating works out of Arabic, and take on sort of works in medicine, astronomy, and other things, and then proceed to develop the disciplines which one day will go on to be canonized as what we consider to be science today. What happened in the Muslim world? Well, people kept studying, and this is the big sort of intervention of the book, is trying to describe how that happens in one corner. People keep studying the natural sciences, but they don't, it does not lead them to the same place that it leads people in Europe. And so what I'm trying to use Kuhn to say is a way of having us appreciate the fact that these sciences continue to be important. They continue in some ways to be central to people's religious practice and their intellectual lives, and they continue to be meaningful. But they did not lead people to the same place and to the same results that the pursuit of the natural sciences led people in Europe. And I'm trying to say, look, that we need to appreciate their significance in Moroccan society, in these specific types of institutions, both rural and urban, that existed at that time period, in order to fully understand their significance, and not simply to write them off because they don't get us to the same place that the natural sciences would go on to be developed into in Europe.
So let's actually talk about the 17th century Morocco. So it's interesting, obviously, because, you know, I know it's now been, I don't widely refuted, although there are still people who think it, that essentially as you get to 1258, which is the Mongol sacking of Baghdad, that's pretty much it for, you know, production, intellectual production in the Muslim world. But over the last, I think, 20 to 30 years, we've seen history move in a direction where, you know, we are now saying, no, there was continued interaction well after it. And you've come in the 17th century Morocco. So, and this is obviously before the beginning of what you could call the colonial era in Morocco, yes, where France directly intervenes. So tell us about 17th century Morocco. What was the scientific and intellectual production like?
So 17th century Morocco is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, it does not belong to what we sometimes call the big three gunpowder empires, or the large-scale political bodies that control much of the Muslim world at this time period, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. It's out there far in the west. It remains independent of Ottoman control. And during the 17th century, it has essentially, in the same way that England kind of falls apart in the 17th century, that is to say, you know, the monarchy falls apart, you kill the king, you have an insurrection, you have a restoration, etc. Morocco also goes through a relatively rocky period politically in the 17th century. You have one dynasty. These are now Arabian Sharifian dynasties that link themselves back to the Prophet, which basically falls apart at the beginning of the 17th century. And you have another Sharifian dynasty that arises out at the end of the 17th century, or in the last third, and takes control and reunites Morocco. And that's one that still controls Morocco today. So when we look at the 17th century, then we see a politically very fractured landscape, but one which is held together, socially speaking, by a lot of intellectual links and intellectual institutions of learning, be they the madrasas, or the kind of the colleges, religious colleges in the urban areas, or be they the zawaya, or the Sufi lodges in the rural and urban areas, right? And so what I was really fascinated here also with delinking political instability from intellectual production, right? So on the one hand, we have a very, very vibrant intellectual production, which is taking place during a very politically tumultuous time. Actually, again, similar to England. England's also not really having the best of times in the 17th century. You got fire, plague, whatnot. So the same things are happening in Morocco. So that makes Morocco quite interesting. Now, previous scholars, people like Khaled Rouaiheb, had really signaled that Morocco was significant during the 17th century, to the extent that it sent scholars from Morocco to Egypt, to the central Mashriq Muslim lands, where they were very influential. They had students, they spread, especially the discipline of logic and so forth. And so I was interested, well, what else is happening here, and how do we understand the specific links and when it comes to the natural sciences? And when I mean natural sciences here, because the term can carry various meanings, but I'm principally talking about medicine, astronomy, but also alchemy, also astrology, the sciences which affect physical bodies. This is to differentiate them from the mathematical sciences. So sometimes astronomy will be listed with the mathematical sciences, and astrology would be listed with the natural sciences. So these can be defined in different ways, but that's what we're talking about. And those are the ones which are being taught and studied. And we have we have numbers, which is also interesting. That within the Islamic intellectual tradition, we have this kind of tabaqat literature where you go through and you write little short biographical entries on everybody who was anybody. That's like a who's who. Everybody who's literate, like what did they study, who did they study with, et cetera, et cetera. And so we can put numbers to my statement that they were meaningful. So roughly 9% of all scholars during this time period studied one or more of the natural sciences. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but look around you and you'll see how many people do you know who actually study astronomy today, right? I mean, so in the broader public, people knew about these things. These sciences were being taught institutionally and privately, and they were transmitted. So once you do that, you begin to get a different picture. Because, just to extend for 1 second, one of the other arguments of the book is that our understanding of Islamic intellectual history during this time period, precisely because of what you brought up about Baghdad and the feeling that nothing was happening, that this was a period of decline, is so poor that one of the things the book tries to do is to say, if we look really closely and do an intense study of one area, then we begin to get an understanding that ideally people would be writing these, like ideally we'd have another book on 17th century Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, and just go on to actually kind of catalog the whole thing, because we're really working in darkness. The source base is all largely in manuscript, and we just don't even really know what's there. And so that's one of the reasons why one of the appendices in the book kind of puts together a list of roughly 120 manuscripts of the natural sciences, which were written in Morocco during that 17th century, and only a handful of which have been published.
It seems like there was actually, from reading your book, from what I took away, there was a sort of quite a broad-based public that could at least read and stuff, because when you sort of look at the backgrounds of the ulama, the Islamic scholarly community in Morocco, you sort of say it's not quite a specific class in the sense that they come from one class background. You point out that they seem to come from different sections of society, whether that be poor or wealthy or whatever. And they're also from different, what we today would say, ethnic backgrounds, so Arab, Amaziha. So there was, a wider pool of people entering these sorts of debates.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things which I still is opaque to me is the exact economics of all of this. But when you go and look at just the architecture of the madrasas in the urban areas, be it Marrakesh or Fez, they are designed to offer small rooms to people who are not from these urban areas to stay in, who would have, now the students in these places would not have been living very luxurious lives. People coming from relatively poor backgrounds would have lived very basic lives, but they had the opportunity, and we have individual examples of this, of if they were smart and worked hard, of being able to use their education as some form of social advancement, ideally for them to get an appointment by the government to work as a judge or something like that. And what's striking here, of course, is this is not just happening in these urban areas. One of the things the book really tries to emphasize, building on earlier scholarship of people who've worked in other parts of North Africa, is how we have rural areas, like areas which today are seen as quite distant, far away from quote unquote, civilization, in the sense that there are no paved roads that necessarily go there, but that were centers of learning, where there were thousands of books that would have been accessible, that people would have been studying and transmitting. And so we can go to the High Atlas. The main Sufi lodge, which I discussed during the book, is the Delet Lodge, which was destroyed at the end of the 17th century, but which is in the Middle Atlas. And as you say, the majority population, especially in rural areas in Morocco, are Amazigh, or frequently referred to as Berber. So these were people who would have been speaking, from whom Arabic would have been a second language, as it still is for many today in Morocco. I mean, Morocco today continues to be an absolutely amazing example of I would say that a large percentage of the population is able to move in and out of 3 languages. And so that was easily being shown off. One of the main characters, whom you referred to the discourses, Al-Yusi, himself comes from an Amazigh background, but demonstrates the sort of the highest level of knowledge of classical Arabic.
Yes, and it's I remember, as you're talking about the rural areas, I do remember reading about French explorers in the 19th century when they go to these rural areas, and they're sort of astonished at the fact that, there are no doctors in these areas, but locals, people within these sorts of villages, you have people who know bits about medicine, about things like practicing virilation, which is the sort of precursor to vaccines in a way, where you take puffs from an infected person with, I think it's smallpox, and you make an incision on somebody who's healthy, and you implant the puffs into their body so that they build up a kind of immunity. So there is a sort of wide body of medical knowledge across Morocco during these periods.
That's true. I mean, actually, I'm intrigued by that, because I don't think I would have to. I don't know of any direct account of variolation in Morocco in this time period. I mean, the famous one, of course, is with Lady Montagu when she goes to in Istanbul and she sees variolation, and then she brings it back to England, right? I mean, so the Ottomans were practicing this, and I'd have to look at it a little bit later and see if I could find that in Morocco. But you're absolutely right in terms of the general perception that is brought in by the French. I mean, the French colonial exploits, first in Algeria, but then in Morocco and also in West Africa, completely, in some ways, distort, as much of the colonial period does, our understanding of the previous intellectual tradition. And the French have a habit of dividing up Morocco into a urban Arab and a rural Berber zone, and of looking at one as being sort of the real Islam, Orthodox Islam, and the other being sort of the non-Orthodox or not really Muslim. And they do the same thing in West Africa with the kind of a black Islam and a white Islam. I mean, I mean, it's not done. They're just bringing a lot of their own stereotypes to the table, and it deforms our understanding. And that deformation has existed, continues to be influential through the decolonization into the post-colonial period as well. So yes, I think it takes a little bit of work for us to understand rural areas as intellectual hubs, and it does push back against a lot of the early 20th century scholarship.
Yes, and I think some of it was also explored in that book, Medicine and the Saints.
Yes,
where she
Ellen
sort of looks
Amthor's
at,
book. Yes.
yes, so that's a pretty good one. So going back to Morocco in the 17th century, could you talk to us a bit about contagion theory and what it looked like?
Sure. So I got obsessed, as you know, with in my first book with the notion of contagion, and spent a long time thinking about contagion. And the reason one of the reasons why I continue to be fascinated with contagion is that it's a subject that brings together very quickly the notion of sort of empirical evidence and medical traditions, and a certain tension with some of the sayings of the prophet. And so you have a question of of the authority of religion and so forth. And so it'd be very easy to follow into a science religion binary here. And that's one of the things which I initially took issue with and said, actually, that's the wrong way to go. Let's take a look at the complexity of both the medical and the religious traditions, right? So the prophet said, for example, that there is no contagion, but he also, is reported to have said that you should run away from the plague if you hear that if it's broken out, and if you're in a country where it's broken out, you shouldn't leave that country. So, and that you should, run away from lepers, but he also is said to have eaten with lepers. And so there's a lot of debates which is then found in the Hadith collections, the collections of the prophetic sayings, and in the commentaries on the Hadith collections. And this makes its way into some of the medical literature. And then after the Black Death, people write these treatises called these plague treatises, trying to explain what's going on with the plague, and how to reconcile and to understand the various bodies of knowledge that we have. In that fashion. So that's been going on for a long time by the time we get to the 17th century, right? It's been 1,000 years or so. But the debates are still relatively the same. That is to say, we find people on one camp and another. In general, what happens, as far as we can empirically think, when the plague breaks out, is certain people, usually the privileged people, run away. Privileged because they have to have somewhere to run to. So we find political rulers often like going to a summer residence outside the city or somewhere else, right? But if you're a poor urban resident and don't have a house to run away to, you generally don't flee. Then there are the scholars, and some of the things the scholars will note is that, empirically speaking, the plague, specifically, contagion is really hard to prove. So we have and their religious traditions, which bear out, in fact, that perhaps the plague is a martyrdom for Muslims, right? So we have some scholars saying, look, the plague's a martyrdom. It is not contagious. The most famous example of this is an Egyptian scholar in the 15th century by the name of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. And he gives accounts of how he has seen how everybody, imagine somebody in a house gets sick, nobody else gets sick. entire one on the other house, an entire house, everybody gets. I mean, I think actually today with coronavirus, we can be kind of more sympathetic to the fact that empirical evidence is often very difficult to parse. But the interesting thing about plague is it's not actually contagious in the sense that it's not transmitted from one person to another, right? That only happens with a kind of with the version of plague called pneumonic plague, where you cough up blood, right? But the vast majority of plague cases were bubonic, and continue to be bubonic. And there you have to have a vector, usually a flea, that would jump from one person who's infected onto another person. And so if you don't have a flea, you can hang out really close to somebody who's sick of the plague and not get infected. It would take that flea to jump from one person to another. So all of that just as background to give us a sense of how it would be that in the 17th century, we find some Muslim scholars in Morocco, as in earlier centuries, writing plague treatises denying that the plague is contagious, while we have other people saying you need to run away as fast as possible, it's really contagious and it's not a good idea to hang around. So in telling that story, then you really get back into those categories, as I was saying at the beginning, about science, religion, how do we evaluate these within their own context and not just take them out in part of a run to the present.
So, I mean, I was going to ask you a little bit about the tobacco debate, but before we get to that one, because you're mentioning, of course, the fact that, you know, when people sort of in Morocco, when they were sort of debating these things, they look at traditions of the Prophet that they sort of use to sort of support whatever position they can sort of, you know, they want to take on infection and stuff.
Right.
And I'm wondering about this category called prophetic medicine, which al-Tab al-Nabawi, because today it sort of exists as this thing that sometimes people look at and say, oh, you know, we should do wet cupping because we find it in these hadith traditions. And I'm wondering how it featured in, whether something like a separate category called prophetic medicine existed in Morocco in the 17th century, and how it interacted with other forms, if indeed at all.
So one could, a generation ago, you kind of would think of Islamic medicine in the Muslim world as a kind of sort of a Galenic or an Ibn Sina version of kind of straight up humoral medicine, and you'd have humor and sort of prophetic medicine over here. We've had some really good, I think, work that's been done over the past 20, 30 years, which has shown us that these borders are far less, they're not clear at all. They flow into each other, right? And so you can read many of the medical texts that I look in the 17th century in Morocco, you know, interact liberally with both humoral medicine and with bringing in traditions related to the Prophet and showing how they reconcile and work. And now, depending on how you want to reconcile something, you can interpret these things differently. So it's not like everybody has the same interpretation, but there's no problem with bringing them together. So instead of seeing them as disparate traditions, I think we can see them as traditions that people tap into to different extents. And I'm beginning to see the same thing when I look at the late 16th century Ottoman Egyptian author Dawood al-Antaqi, whose very popular book, Al-Tadhkira, does something similar when thinking about plague and leprosy and other contagious diseases. He's very willing to interact both with the Galenic tradition or with the Abyssinian sort of reframing of the Galenic tradition, and with the important prophetic traditions which may be relevant.
Yeah, because that's my sort of impression, because I was reading the other day about it, and what they were sort of suggesting is that a lot of the prophetic medicine, what they call prophetic medicine, is actually interactions of Hellenic ideas, so Galenic medicine, popular folk traditions that exist around medicine, and, you know, other sort of medical traditions weave together with sayings that have been taken from the Prophet or supposedly attributed to him, and this is what the body of prophetic medicine actually is.
Right. It's just that we shouldn't think of that coexisting along some kind of pure Galenic medicine, right? They're all mixed to various extents in certain ways. I mean, and also one of the things which I found most striking. So if you go back to one of the first real Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah's Tibb an-Nabawi from the 14th century, you'll find that in that his understanding of prophetic medicine, in many ways, because it's a full-on Galenic framework in which he happens just to kind of bring in the prophetic stuff on the side. So I'm leery of breaking them up, because that can into two different sort of genealogies, because that can then lead us to this belief that one is kind of a high medicine and one is kind of a low medicine. When we find people of the highest intellectual and medical order finding ways to bring them together in ways. So it's maybe even wrong to say bring together. They just are different parts of a larger discussion of how to interpret medical knowledge.
So we'll move to because you talk a little bit about in your book the tobacco debates, and it's also kind of a good illustration of how sort of the hierarchy of knowledge also works, because you point out that you have ulama who consider themselves, the highest body of people who can discern knowledge in society, but they don't disregard any medical evidence, although they tend to think of doctors as lower down than themselves, but they are very keenly following all the latest developments coming out of this field of medical study to sort of draw opinions upon. And usually, from what I could tell from your book, they would very rarely disagree with the empirical evidence. They might disagree with some of the interpretation if offered to them.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that part of the problem with smoking, and many people know this from the 20th century, is that the empirical evidence can be difficult to ascertain, right? So during my lifetime, people have still been arguing about whether smoking is actually bad for your health. Now, today, we can all pretty much be like, yes, okay, now we know. But in the 17th century, people were also arguing about that. So in the book, the tobacco debate functions as a way of arguing that the natural sciences were important, not just for the people practicing and studying them, but they also had a deep impact on the field of fiqh, or of Islamic jurisprudence. And so that even by people who were not actually studying or transmitting them, they made deep inroads into how Islamic law, which in many ways affected a much larger percentage of the inhabitants of the Middle East than, say, the natural sciences in a direct fashion, that also played a role there. And so the tobacco shows up in Morocco at the end of the 16th century. Where does it come from? It comes, interestingly enough, from West Africa. So it's coming up across the Sahara. It's brought into Marrakesh and then Fez and spreads. And unsurprisingly, tobacco becomes very popular very quickly. And also, unsurprisingly, the authorities and religious scholars, many of whom are very unhappy about it and see it as is potentially against Islamic law. And the Ottomans and other people will also get worried about it as a new form of sociality that will produce forms of social behavior that they can see as politically threatening, which is why it comes in along with coffee shops. It gets to be something that has to be controlled or shut down, or attempts have to be made for that. But what I try to do in the book is to say, okay, look, there are all of these people who are pro-smoking, or not pro-smoking, but who say that it's licit, that it's okay, you can do it. There's no prohibition against it. And there are other people who say, no, you can't do it. Now, some of the arguments of the people who say you can't smoke are based not on what we can think of as medical, but more perhaps aesthetic things. Like, just as the Prophet said that you shouldn't go to the mosque and pray while smelling of garlic, you also shouldn't go to the mosque and pray while smelling of tobacco. Like arguments like that, or arguments such as, well, if smoke's coming out of your mouth, don't you think that you're a little bit like those people in hell, right? I mean, these types of arguments, on the one hand, but then there are other people who say, wait a second, this stuff is bad for you, and it's bad for you, and you should not do things that harm yourself, right? This is a sort of a legal injunction. You cannot throw yourself into destruction. You shouldn't be smoking like this. And so then it becomes a question, or who see tobacco as a form of intoxication, right? Now, we all know that intoxication and things which make you drunk are forbidden. So does tobacco make you drunk? Well, then we have to get down, and this is because it comes to a medical question, right? There are some who say, well, yes, it is a form of intoxication, because when they smoke it, they become entirely, in a different state of mind, and et cetera, et cetera. There are other people who say, actually, this is distinct. This is more like people who we have given a sedative to, before we operate or something, or and so forth. And so then you're talking now about sort of a physiological state of the mind, and that your ability to ascertain that and to draw upon medical knowledge to do that is a necessity for being able to practice Islamic law. And so in that, I'm less interested in who wins, so to speak, the debate. There are very prominent jurists, Al-Ujhuri in Egypt, Ahmed Baba al-Timbukti, the very famous scholar from Timbuktu, spent time in Morocco, who are fine with smoking. But they are, admittedly, at the end of the day, for all you pro-smokers, unfortunately, they are a minority. And the majority of scholars do go with this view that you shouldn't smoke. But it's fascinating to see how that debate can't take place unless you bring your knowledge of the human body into Islamic, into the law, into the legal discussion. And so that's the role that it plays for me in the book.
To sort of now move on from that to your latest publication, you've translated Amaziha scholar Al-Hassan Al-Yusi. Could you tell us about him and his work?
So Al-Yusi is the guy who got me, who connected the first two, connected Infectious Ideas and Revealed Sciences for me. As I was finishing the end of Infectious Ideas, I was given by Maribel Fierro, this amazing scholar of Islamic Spain in Madrid. She said, you should really read Al-Yusi. Al-Yusi always has something interesting to say. He's a creative thinker. And I was like, never heard of this guy. Let's have a look at him. This is like more than a decade ago, actually almost 15 years ago now. And so I picked it up. And I started reading Al-Yusi was a very prolific scholar. He lives between 1631 and about 60 years later. So he lives right to smack dab during that middle of the 17th century when everything is kind of fallen apart. We have people controlling northern Morocco, people controlling southern Morocco. He's from a place called Sefrou, which is a little bit outside of Sefrou, which is near Fez in the Middle Atlas. And you're absolutely right, he's of Amazigh background, but he himself is so Arabized that you would never really know that. He wrote on theology, he wrote on logic, and he wrote on poetry. And at the end of his life, and was famous, actually, he comes to attention, first of all, to American anthropologists like Clifford Geertz, who spent time in Sefrou back in the 70s. People still tell stories about him as a kind of a saint-like figure who stands up to Moulay Ismail, this very authoritarian early figure of the Alawite dynasty, and rebukes him for not behaving properly as a ruler. So he has this kind of saint-like, speaking truth to power reputation. But people hadn't edited his works and actually read them until the 1980s and later. Before that, they'd only been really read in manuscript and only by a few people. And one of the first works, which was edited by the amazing Moroccan scholar Mohammed Haji, was this book called Al-Muhadarat, or the Discourses. And this is the book I chose to translate. And what's interesting about this is a book that Al-Yusi writes very late in life. So he's had a long life in which his status has become so great that he's become, respected by the major political leaders, by the major intellectual folks at the time. And he looks back on his life and on his experiences, and it's one of these books that has these little autobiographical anecdotes and sort of thoughts about Morocco of his time period. So these types of books are actually comparatively rare. We don't get too many people in the pre-modern period writing this way. And so writing it is kind of a slice of life insight into intellectual culture in the 17th century. And then he does all sorts of mini essays. The one that drew me into him initially was when he talks about Contagion. And so I looked at that. But then I started thinking, this actually needs to be translated as a whole so we can fully appreciate the nature of it. And I was lucky enough at that time period, having recently joined NYU Abu Dhabi, to meet Phil Kennedy, who was executive director of this project called the Library of Arabic Literature. And through that, they have this whole sort of approach to helping people create these facing page translations of Arabic English and doing them in a very nice way, which is approachable, affordable texts. And so I did the first volume there, and I'm now hopefully working on the second one. And I would hope that what it would do was give people kind of an insight into what it meant to be a cultured, Arabized, Amazigh scholar of that time period. Somebody who has no problem disputing and disagreeing with other prominent Islamic scholars, speaks his own mind, and also gives like little anecdotes about his own day, which are fascinating.
So my last question now, I want to turn to the issue of archives, particularly dealing with pre-Ottoman archives, because obviously Ottoman archives are, they're pretty decent. I mean, we get a lot of work out of them, but pre-Ottoman archives, we have some issues, right, with in the Arab world more broadly. And I'm wondering how Moroccan archives compare to, say, the wider Arab world pre-Ottoman.
Well, you see, Morocco, I mean, from a historical perspective, maybe I should wish that Morocco had been colonized by the Ottomans. But obviously I don't. But in the sense that the Ottomans have, yes, you're right to say that there are good archives and there are good, they've done a good job, comparatively good job of cataloging the materials that they have. And Morocco was never, was always independent, was never colonized by the Ottomans, and so it sticks out of that. So what do we find then when we go to, say, the Royal Library of Morocco or the National Library of Morocco? When it comes down to archives, and Europeanists, when they think about archives, they think about administrative records, right, of different kinds. And yes, there we are before the 19th century. We really don't have anywhere near what we would like to have. So what we're dealing with by and large are manuscripts. That is to say, normative texts, chronicles, works, but also works in the natural sciences, which is a lot of what I talk about, and literature and so forth. And there we have what we think, an estimate of roughly 100,000 manuscripts, right? A huge number, and the vast majority of which has not been published. And most of that 100,000 would be produced in the 16th century forward. So it doesn't go back before that period. So we don't have as much for like the medieval period or the early or medieval period. In fact, a lot of Moroccan history from after up until, through the 13th, 14th, 15th century, up until the period that I'm looking at, actually, we see it much less clearly because the number of sources we have is not as great. And even into the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, we still find that a lot of the accounts by European travelers and visitors are able to give us insights into the day-to-day life, which we don't get from sources in Arabic. A prominent exception would, of course, be somebody like Leo Africanus or Leo Africano, who comes back to, leaves Granada, spends a lot of time in North Africa before he ends up converting to Christianity and going off to Italy in the early 16th century. So when we look at this, when we try to tell the story of Morocco, we're dealing with a lot of sources which are still either inaccessible or which have been used for types of local history that don't engage with larger broader narratives, or simply have not been mined. Now, so that's one part of it. The other part of it is what I think I call kind of the political economy of not just of manuscript preservation, but also of studies. Like, so how well are the humanities supported in much of the Arab world? Sadly, the answer is not terribly well. And I say this by comparison. When I look at myself and my ability to write books, to have a career, to have a decent paying job, I can support my family, I can live a relatively comfortable life, not relatively, just a comfortable life doing so. And I compare myself with my Moroccan colleagues, many of whom have done the grunt work, the basic work for doing Moroccan history, who've edited the texts, who've cataloged the materials, who have published, groundbreaking works with deep insights that upon, I'm here like on the shoulders of giants type of thing. They are existing in an economy, in a university system that does not give them that kind of support, and either research support or otherwise. And that's part of one of the issues that I mentioned in passing in the book, in which I would hope that with greater collaborations we can kind of alleviate. But it also helps us explain why we don't have as good an understanding of some of these periods as we could have. Part of it is simply, it has been an Orientalist kind of disregard of studies written in Arabic by local Moroccan scholars, which I'm very much leaning a great deal on local Moroccan scholarship writing this book, and deeply grateful for it. But part of it has also been that the post-colonial Arab states have not developed a rigorous support of the humanities. It's hard to say because right now the humanities are being gutted in much of Europe and the United States as well, but they're not doing terribly well in the Arab world either. So that we really would need people to invest more in this if we want to have a better understanding of the past, which unfortunately is in desire for this is perhaps in short supply when it comes to most funding agencies.
But you yourself are looking at archival projects, aren't you, to sort of launch?
Well, what we're doing is with this, see, my Europeanist colleagues would not consider what we're doing archival, because they would consider archival like saying the slips of paper related to the relationship between the local council and a Pacific, these types of things, whereas much of the materials that we're trying to put together into a broader database that would be searchable would be kind of the types of manuscripts that I used in the writing of this book, right? So, I mean, the revealed sciences. So if I say that there's 100,000 manuscripts, right, and we say that roughly as an estimate that people have, we don't even, there's no website where I can go to and say, okay, put in your question, see how that comes up in all of those manuscripts, right? So we've got the Royal Library has been cataloged, the National Library has been cataloged, individual local libraries have been cataloged. Some of the greatest lodges, their libraries have been cataloged. But if you want to know what any given author has written, you have to go through all of these, like, say 20 disparate catalogs with their different systems and their different numbering systems and try to figure it out. And there's no easy way to do that automatically. Now, people in West Africa, and this is something that's run by Bruce Hall out of Berkeley, have built up a manuscript catalog of Islamic manuscripts that come out of, say, Mali and Senegal, and are trying to incorporate, say, the massive holdings of Timbuktu as well into that. And what I'm hoping to be able to do, once we can actually do the entries, with 100,000 entries with roughly 20 columns to do a bilingual Arabic and English, you can imagine the amount of man hours that this takes, is to do this and then to incorporate that, to link these together so that you could then say, you're interested in Al-Yusi, well, where and in which libraries are the works of Al-Yusi preserved from Morocco throughout West Africa? And you could put that in and you'd get the answer, right? Now that's a fantasy at the moment. There is no database that will do that. Hopefully, inshallah, within the next decade or so, we'll develop that so that graduate students and scholars and just general people who are interested at that point can do these searches and can even then take these, map it out onto in a visual sense to get a sense of where manuscripts are, how they have moved. And you can also do it then chronologically. There's all sorts of interesting digital humanities possibilities here. And then they'll be able to tell the types of histories that I've been working on and that others have also been working on with much less work. And then they can spend much more time on the fun analyzing stuff and much less time on the running around trying to find out where things are stuff, which takes years at times.
Justin Stearns, thank you for talking to us at Memo Conversations.
It's been a real pleasure, Usman. Thank you so much for having me.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Please do tune in next time for more Memo Conversations.